Welcome everybody to this presentation on remembering socialism in post-hegemonic Lithuania, agonistic memory as a relational concept. My name is Christophe. I'm a senior researcher at the Georg Eckert Institute for International Textbook Research in Braunschweig, Germany. In today's talk, I will discuss with you the life story of Adele, a Lithuanian history teacher born in 1955. I will basically show how the aim to disrupt the two rival narratives of remembering socialism that form the backbone of the post-hegemonic Lithuanian memory culture shapes her practices of recalling the Soviet past. Just for the sake of putting a bit more emphasis on the surprising and maybe even challenging part of my argument, I'm basically claiming that Adele, the citizen of an Eastern European country usually perceived to be rather backward, nationalistic, and in need of mnemonic advice from the more enlightened Western Europe, is presenting us with a very much innovative account. An account, to be precise, which can be seen as a bottom-up example of what has been termed the agonistic mode of memory in recent theoretical debates. In memory studies, as you all probably know, this specific mode of remembering is often discussed as a better alternative to a cosmopolitan mode of memory, since it offers a more effective antidote to the antagonistic memory more and more successfully propagated by all sorts of populists. However, in line with the good old ethnographic tradition of providing thick descriptions, I will first jump into the middle of Adele's story, carving out the peculiar features that turn her account into a theoretically relevant case. I will then raise the question of why she does what she does, looking mainly at the context she is responding to. In trying to understand her, I will at the same time try to understand what it takes to open up spaces for the unfolding of agonistic memory. Embarking on interpretation, I will finally suggest to conceptualize agonistic memory as a relational concept. Deviating from the definitions given so far in the literature, I will thus claim that the characteristic features of that specific mode of remembering cannot be listed once and forever. They have to be worked out for each and every context, paying close attention to the specific memory culture they are meant to destabilize. As I said, I start with describing Adele's life story. The first thing that caught my attention when reading the transcript of her interview was an interesting paradox. Adele hardly ever argues. She mainly sticks to the action scheme of narrating. She presents us with a carefully composed symphony of narratives, all of which serve to illustrate one simple truth. The ideological divide between the former supporters and opponents of the Soviet system that still haunts the Lithuanian society, as we will see in a second, is rather treacherous. You find good and bad people in both camps. Just to give some examples from her account. The head of the local party in the town Adele has been working in for decades serves as a role model for the good communist. According to her, he did not only push lazy bureaucrats into action, at great personal risk, he also stood up for the preservation of a monument to Vytautas the Great, the medieval Lithuanian ruler who had become a national icon in the interwar period and had fallen to disgrace under Soviet times for that very reason. At the same time, Adele also tells stories about morally corrupt communists, like the chairman of the collective farm she grew up in, who tried to fill his own pockets with the money she herself has earned tending the shop during her student years. When she talks about the opponents to Soviet power, she follows exactly the same pattern. A rather complicated set of stories she is offering about the church, which is seen by many as the backbone of opposition to Soviet rule, serves as a perfect illustration. in a rather dense narrative which is centered around three distinct stories on state-church relations, all of which seem to invite us to arrive at rather opposing conclusions about how things really were in those Soviet days, Adele is actually continuously interrupting, correcting, and undermining herself. In her first story, a colleague of Adele falls victim to the anti-church policy of a state which fires her because she, a teacher who was supposed to back up the atheist propaganda, had a religious ceremony for her own wedding. In the second story, Adele escapes the same destiny because a priest abstained from officially registering her church marriage as well as the baptism of her kids, anticipating that this could have caused a lot of trouble to her. The third story then introduces a priest who blames the headmaster of the school Adele is working for of murdering Lithuanian children by exposing them to atheist propaganda. The attack actually takes place at a most inappropriate moment, during the funeral of the headmaster's mother. That is, in a situation when that man actually showed quite a lot of courage by attending a church ceremony which could easily have brought his career to a sudden end. As we can see from these examples, Adele is constantly positioning herself. The position she takes is, however, not so much reflected in the single stories she offers us. It rather takes shape in the interspaces between those stories. In all three stories, teachers are the protagonists. There is, however, great variation in the experiences they all make. Whereas the first teacher is a victim of a fanatic state, the third teacher is a victim of a no less fanatic church. The lesson to be drawn from this is apparently that both state and church do not so much oppose each other, they actually do have a lot in common. Both of them have become perpetrators who are only too ready to sacrifice real existing people for the sake of their rigid ideologies. At the same time, Adele's example shows that nobody had to fall victim to anybody, and that nobody had to sacrifice anybody if only people would have shown some reasonableness. I will now close the chapter on describing and embark on trying to understand Adele. For me, the most important thing to be learned about her is that there is one crucial feature she really appreciates more than anything else in a person. And this is the ability to resist the gravitational pull of ideologically shaped common sense assumptions. As I will point out now, this is also something she herself lays claim to, as we can learn from the way she constructs her own personal memories of socialism. These memories are carefully and with utmost consistency designed to destabilize the two master narratives that are characteristic of the Lithuanian culture of memory. Let me quickly sketch out the main lines of conflict among different mnemonic actors in Lithuania, competing with each other before I return to Adele's story once more. Although almost all Lithuanians subscribe to the view that the Soviet Union was an evil empire based on suppression, they passionately disagree with regard to the question of who could be credited with having lived a morally acceptable life under morally unbearable circumstances. The conservative-minded nationalists cast three categories of actors: the anti-Soviet partisans, the church, and the dissidents, into the role of the heroes, openly despising everybody else for being either a coward or a perpetrator. The no less nationalistic leftists charge the partisans and the dissidents with having risked the life of thousands of people in a hopeless fight that they could have never won. For them, It is the honest official who had joined the Communist Party with the sole purpose of serving the interests of his or her nation we should proudly remember. Against this backdrop, we can see that Adele is actually pursuing a rather complex agenda. First of all, she renders visible how selective the memories offered by both types of political actors actually are. Focusing on all the ambiguities and complexities that do not fit into the well-established memory frames of either left or right political actors, she implicitly blames all of them of pushing a lot of things under the carpet. At the same time, she should not be understood as organizing a revolt in the name of messy experience against the distortions of politically shaped master narratives. This is an argument often brought up in literature dealing with mnemonic resistance. With no access to power and media channels, the argument goes, people can only resort to the raw material of experience in order to escape the mnemonic dictates of elites. I strongly disagree with that perspective, not only on epistemic grounds and because I'm convicted that none of us can ever hope to reach out to pure experience. All we can get is edited experience, bearing the heavy imprint of culturally shaped frames of perceiving and remembering. I furthermore think that Adele's story is a perfect illustration to that epistemic insight. She is actually presenting her life story as a very much consciously designed sequence of stories that are serving a clear-cut purpose. Turning the interest in disrupting dominant narratives into the criteria that steers her process of selecting these stories, she herself creates very political mnemonic frames. Her very much political and rather self-confident intervention thus does not have very much in common with the so-called silent majority in post-socialist societies, which, according to some of the literature, is mainly displaying a distance to publicly circulating memory narratives by focusing on the presumably less political everyday. One factor accounting for Adele being different is to be found in the structure of the Lithuanian memory culture she is actively engaging with. The constant competition between the two versions of the past I've just outlined exposes not only the political inherent to all processes of remembering, it also prevents a hegemonic closure of debate. At the same time, the ritualized contestation leads to a sharpening of edges, to a dramatization of differences. Such a constellation could not differ more significantly from the mixture of broad but vague consensus and ambivalence described time and again as being characteristic of the memory cultures of Western society. Coming to my last step, to interpretation, I will now try to interpret Adele's intervention into the Lithuanian culture of memory by reflecting on its main features against the backdrop of what has been termed agonistic memory recently. I will mainly argue that it is the peculiarities of the national context Adele is operating in which explain why she embraces some but dismisses other features referred to in the literature on agonistic memory. Yes, Adele avoids the construction of binaries between good and bad, between perpetrators and victims, and thus does something which is classified as an indispensable characteristic of agonistic memory. And yes, she presents a lot of evidence which serves the aim of undermining the plausibility of these very categories and the way of perceiving the world they support. Finally, as suggested by those who coined the concept of agonistic memory as a normative ideal, she furthermore goes a long way to explain the behavior of the people she is talking about, people who are often too readily discarded and judged as being morally unacceptable. However, in one crucial point, she clearly departs from the prescriptions made by the proponents of agonistic memory. She does not replace moral reasoning found to be typical of cosmopolitan memory with political reasoning perceived to be a key feature of agonistic memory. At the same time, she is ignoring the well-minded advice to repoliticize memory that was given against the backdrop of mainly Western European experience with cosmopolitan memory for a pretty good reason. As I've tried to point out with my sketchy portrait of the Lithuanian culture of memory, Adele is not intervening into the typical memory discourse of the so-called cosmopolitan West, a discourse that at times has been tamed and depoliticized by thousands of compromises. She is rather intervening into a heated and passionate debate between antagonistic views of the past, both of which push each other to the extremes, and both of which thus suffer from an excess of the political. I would therefore recommend defining agonistic memory as a relational concept, the concrete features of which depend on the context it is interacting with. Just to remind you, all authors who set out to characterize how agonistic memory should look like were on the same page with regard to one crucial aspect. Agonistic memory was meant to be disruptive, to undermine illusionary consensus, to account for struggle and conflict, to provide room for contingency and undecidability, to quote from a seminal paper of Bull and Hansen. It was expected to place emphasis on multi-perspectivity, on ambivalence, to programmatically target the disruption of the traditional discourses, to add the voices of other authors actively taking part in the same debate. To cut a long story short, agonistic memory was designed to be an intervention. But in order to design an intervention, one needs to know what are the main features of the memory culture one wants to disrupt. And in that respect, we will find huge differences between societies where memory is mainly perceived as being politically correct but boring, and societies where memory is perceived to be biting, to be painful, because it is an object of fierce political infighting. The latter describes precisely the context Adele is intervening in. And taking into account the peculiarities of that context, she designs her agonistic interventions. Where the typical mnemonic entrepreneurs in Lithuania would paint politically charged black and white pictures, she is drawing attention to complexity and nuances, to shades of grey. Against that backdrop, and taking really seriously my empirical findings, I would thus like to encourage us to include these kind of interventions into a new discussion on agonistic memory as a relational concept, which will change its features depending on the context it is meant to disrupt. And this it is, by and large. I'm very much looking forward to a hopefully very agonistic discussion with a lot of disruption and intervention. See you all on October 1st.